Good evening. It is with great pleasure that I get to introduce my old grad school friend, David Buckley Borden, as tonight's Baumer lecturer. David is an artist and designer who works nimbly and compellingly in a wide range of disciplines and scales. What I've often found most fascinating about David's work was not just how it is intriguingly fluid, flowing between art and landscape architecture, prints, painting, sculpture, and warm humor, but how it uses ecology as a common reference point, and not ecology as some breezy, superficial gesture towards nature, but as a real, rigorous scientific practice and a commitment to communicating complex ideas about the world in a warm, funny, and humane way. I'm excited to let David talk about the work, so I'll go through a bit of his interesting biography before we get on with the show. David received his MLA from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and practiced as a landscape architect at the legendary Sasaki firm before moving on to practice his art full-time. There's a lesson in this for students. It's not like he quit his job and switched on at becoming an artist. He was always producing, almost compulsively so, even as I remember when he was an MLA student. David comes to us from Oregon, where he is currently a senior advisor of creative practice and innovation at the Center for Future Forests, or Future of Forests, and Society at Oregon State University's College of Forestry, and I've also learned is not only at Oregon State, but is also at the University of Oregon, where he teaches landscape architecture as well. He arrived in Oregon after a circuitous route through several other forests, having done research fellowships at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest and the Harvard Research Forest, developing a collaborative art and research practice that has him leading a team of like-minded artists, designers, and fabricators, and collaborating on science communication writing with research scientists. He has published and exhibited widely and continues to consult with landscape architecture firms. And as if he is not busy enough, he is currently also a fellow in innovation and leadership at the Landscape Architecture Foundation. Before I call him up, I just want to read this line from his official bio. David advocates for new models of interdisciplinary environmental education by focusing on joyful solutions to the practical convergence of community, ecology, and design. We could all use some more joyful solutions. Please welcome David Buckley Borden.
This is where I awkwardly ask if this thing's on. Is this thing on? You in the back. Okay, it was my fault. Thanks, John. Thank you all for welcoming me here. John just did the hard part. And so I'll give a little bit of my background just for context. But really, we're just going to nerd out for the next 40 minutes. And then I'd like to leave a big chunk of time for questions. Nerd out. I imagine most of you can just quick show your hands, landscape folks. I love it. Architects? I still love it. Planning. Boo hiss, not a single planner. Okay, it's funny because those are the folks I think need the most help with their graphics. But I'd like to start off with a prompt. And so I love this image. I love what it represents, but I also love what I've learned from it by asking folks to describe it as a prompt for discussing science communication. And typically with an audience like this, it's usually a little left-leaning in terms of the response, but at a general audience, I'll get a wide spectrum of response. On one end of the spectrum, and my dad, dear old dad would be in this end, he said, "That's an eyesore. It's a liability. It should be cut down, we should chip it, we should mulch it. Maybe we can like mulch the barberry or the Japanese honeysuckle or the burning bush." On the other end of the spectrum, my mom, she would say, "That's a valuable input to a viable ecosystem. Its habitat, its food, it should be respected and honored accordingly." And I would argue how you kind of respond to the prompt says a lot about your value system that was in no part informed by your education in terms of your ecological literacy. And so the work I'm sharing today is really in this small niche of science communication. And I should start by showing you the typical science communication. I love this stuff, don't get me wrong. I love it because it's a little bit confusing. But I'm going to talk about an alternative to conventional practice in terms of science communication, both embedded in the sciences, but also as it seeps out into popular culture. And so this is one way of looking at the value of that dead snag, that dead tree. And this is another way. And so this is my way. When I say my way, it's collaborative. But the idea of how can we use pop culture, whether it's in a gallery or in the landscape itself, to heighten ecological awareness and ideally prompt more empowered stewardship. If I had to diagram, I'm a big diagram fan. If I had to diagram it, I would look something like this. And just to be really clear, the art and design is in service to science communication. When I give this talk at art schools, I often get some hisses from the back row and that what is the word they fancy use the word? I'm instrumentalizing the practice. I would say bullshit. I'm just providing value for society. But that diagram is part of a larger series of work that I just wrapped up with the Landscape Architecture Foundation, fabulous fellowship program. And it had one pointed research question, and that's really how can science communication be reimagined as a collaborative process between science and design? And I want to kind of unpack that through the lens of a couple of projects. And so, as John said, I teach studio and environmental communication theory at UO, and I just started a new position. That's a pregnant pause. Called Senior Advisor in Creative Practice and Innovation at the Center for the Future of Forest and Society in the Department of Ecosystems and Research at the College of Forestry in Corvallis. Would you believe I'm there to help them with communication? Okay, I can't help myself. A couple of quick learning objectives. Really, I want to kind of highlight some of the wins and some of the successes and power of the work, but also look at some of the constraints and the limitations of it. And so there are plenty of both with this space, but I think understanding some of the practical challenges will go a long way beyond me just spouting theory. A quick background recap. I love landscape. I grew up in a small townish. There was a Dairy Queen, that was it, put it in perspective. 3 brothers, 2 of them went to art school, one of them environmentalists, complete with the FBI record and the Earth First tattoos. I was the black sheep when I went and studied marketing and entrepreneurship at Northeastern. And out of school, I got a job as a high-tech market research analyst. My dad was super proud. I hated it though. So I lasted about 18 months. And as a counter to that experience, I took a night class at Radcliffe Institute, which was a landscape design program that was taught by 2 brilliant recent GSD grads. And they introduced landscape design through land art. And I was just like, oh my God, people get to do this for a living. I want to do this. But before that could happen, this happened to me. And so my brother ran this thing called Kaiju Big Battle, which was essentially a live action comedy show. Imagine, in terms of you Venn diagram folks, WWE, Japanese kaiju movies, and then pop culture parody a la The Simpsons. And we developed this thing from a little punk rock thing to basically a little cult empire. And I worked on this for 8 years, and this is where I really gained value and insight into storytelling, the power of pop culture, and really big collaborative teams. We got a morning show with Hasbro and G4 TV, and that was my moment to bow out to go to land art school. Shit, there is no land art school, so I went to this place. Graduate School of Design, Graduate School of Divorce, grayscale, death. This is a really common kind of output from that period at the GSD. Super clear, not really inspiring, but very clear, using maps and graphics as both analytical tools, but also as design tools. After a while, I didn't want to do it anymore. And so for the first half of my academic career, I was a good soldier. And then all the good instructors left and all these urbanists came. And then I just kind of had something to push against. So I would take what they were teaching me in terms of the graphic conventions and try to reimagine them. And some of the instructors loved it. Some of them hated it. And so this was basically a design proposal for the Boston Harbor Islands, 31 unique islands, 31 unique ecologies, 31 unique design solutions. They asked me to make a timeline. How many hate making timelines? I know there's more than 5 of you. I understand the value of the timeline, but I also understand the frustration of the timeline. And so there's to make a timeline of the Boston Harbor and its land management and the conflict. And so I developed this as a timeline evocative of a game board. And so I got pretty good at making sweet posters. I'm not bragging, that's an admission of failure. I didn't know how to build anything. And so then I was lucky enough to land a job at Sasaki where I learned the ins and outs of construction. But at the same time while this was going on, I still made these drawings. And so this is basically a diagram of the impact of the beaver on the geomorphology of eastern Massachusetts. Nerd with a capital N. Masshole. You think you know what it is, but you don't. Because to me, it's about a soil profile in Massachusetts. And so my friend Laura, one of my grad school buddies, our grad school friends are really good because they give it to us straight when we need to hear it. And she said, these are really cute, but what are you doing with them? Can you actually apply these to a project? And at the time, we were both like nerds for bison and all kind of ecological engineers. And so we'd nerd out about this guy, Hornaday's Maps. And she's like, well, like, what would you do with this? And I took it as a challenge. Like, can we develop work that's spatially accurate, that's data-driven, but has a little more cultural hook, a little more evocative for the storytelling? And so this was my response to it. And then I would do this for a number of years. I left Sasaki, and then I went feral for 2 years. What does that mean? Wild. I escaped the confines of domestication, and I went wild. Some of my classmates were like, what happened to him? I heard he freaked out. I heard he lost it. Other people were like, no, he's doing his thing. So for 2 years, I gave myself to just do self-directed projects. And at the end of the 2 years, I did an exhibition that caught the attention of the folks at the Harvard Forest, and then they invited me out there to do a fellowship just based on the work. How many are familiar with the Harvard Forest? Maybe you've never been there, because if you did, you would be like, I know it, because it's an amazing place. It's about 6,000 acres. It's a long-term ecological research site. What does that mean? That means it has a land agency that is almost unknown, dedicated to research. It's one of 27 sites in North America right now. And so they're kind of at this interesting cultural space. They're far removed from the university, meaning it's about 100 miles away from Harvard. And it's kind of nice, because they're just a bunch of nerds doing their thing, but they also realize they need outside influence. And so I was there as a Bullard Fellow, fabulous program, historically reserved for scholars and mid-career scholars and ecologists in forestry. I wasn't any of those, but a lot of these programs that are historically geared towards scientists are starting to open up and fold in other people, because they realize they need interdisciplinary minds to solve some of these problems. And so there I was in 2016. That was the studio. No heat, no water, a perimeter of poison ivy. It was perfect. But all the work, when I proposed the work, I didn't propose an art project, or it's certainly not a design project. I said, well, I want to do science communication. And so science communication, I think it's worth defining, because it gets thrown around pretty loosely. But really, it's just this idea you're communicating scientific knowledge to non-experts. And usually you're trying to push some needle. So you're trying to have an impact, trying to have a result. And I did a number of projects, but there's two I think that are worth pointing out. One was an interpretive trail project, and one was a kind of a campus installation. And as I go through these, I'm going to pull out some of those LAF diagrams to unpack the relevance. The nice thing about the LAF experience, it had, I don't know, 6-7 years since the projects occurred. So I actually went back and spoke with the research community, and then we kind of evaluated what worked and what didn't work. It was a total treat. And so Hemlock Hospice, it's a site-specific science communication project, tells the story of the death of the hemlock ecosystem, essentially at the hands and mouths of the hemlock woolly adelgid, a small invasive insect from Japan, but also told larger stories relative to the eastern hemlock, and then climate change, and of course, future of New England forest and its extinction. By the bullet, so I don't forget anything, it was an interpretive trail. It was a kind of a narrative, a story that unfolded with each sequence installation. It was sensitive and low impact by design because it is an ongoing research forest. And it was a collaborative process, I think most importantly, with the Harvard forest community. It was temporary, so they were willing to take a risk. But I think most importantly, in terms of its success, it had 1 year for build out and they had 1 year for promotion support, which is what they were wanting to do. That's the star of the show. He's wild. He's about the size of a poppy seed. Largely invisible except for these little white sacs, which they hide on. Essentially, this insect has a little stylus, puts its stylus into the base of the needle, and over the course of 6 to 12 years can kill a tree of significant size. The project itself was pretty, in its simplest sense, it was an out and back trail, interpretive trail, but instead of having little books on a stick, in terms of your natural history interpretation, it had installations. And it had all the kind of other accoutrements of a landscape architecture project in terms of being site responsive, trail design, wayfinding, guide maps, blah, blah, blah. But as I said, each of the installations actually told a story had a beat to the overall story. And so this one was one of the first ones that just announces the arrival of the insect through contaminated nursery stock. The work was deliberately abstract. It was also deliberately bright, so you could actually see it. It was legible in the woods. Also, I should mention it was all made from recycled materials, well, about 90% of it, I would say. Another one made from recycled materials. Again, it wasn't just the insect, but the insect combined with climate change and global warming was wreaking havoc on the ecosystem. It also spoke to the future of the forest. So right off the screen to the left is a massive black birch thicket, which is the next kind of species in line with the death of the forest in terms of succession. And of course, it framed the whole thing in the larger context of the six-mass extinction. Bummer aside, what we were designing actually was a learning experience. And so we didn't look at it as individual installations, but how can we develop an experience for education, a deep, meaningful experience that's place-based. And so this is right out of landscape architecture and architecture, the project was layered in terms of its narrative and its scale. There's a bunch of ways to slice this. In the beginning, this is how I used to diagram. It seems really sad now, but this is how I used to diagram my practice. And that art was the kind of the cultural tip, informed by design thinking and supported by science. And I slowly started to expand it. But at the time of this project, I realized the real foundation and the real success factor that often gets overlooked is actually the community of people you're developing it with. And so the Harvard Forest has many communities, the researchers that live there, the ones that fly in from all over the world, school groups, grad students, the local community. And we needed to develop a project that kind of appealed to all of them, which was a big ask. One of the ways I like to initiate these types of projects is doing what I call like a collaborative inventory. And so you're just having these conversations with your potential collaborators, really trying to get a sense of where their skills and interests and values are. In many respects, doesn't matter. It's just the fact that you're having these conversations. You don't really need to quantify them. But the process, I think, led to better understanding of what they were interested and what I was interested in, where they met. The other challenge for this type of work, question I was getting, well, where do you start? And as a trained landscape architect, I can't help but start with the material, because the material kind of transcends all the people, the place, and the practice of any site. And so they had it all in terms of New England. I mean, almost like cloyingly, disgustingly saccharine sweet. Cows, sugar shacks, stone walls. They have an old golf course that had been turned into a cow pasture. They had another layer to the forest that was really interesting to me is it was a working forest as well. So they harvested all the wood for the bioburners, the heating system, but also for the capital improvements on site. And a counter to this kind of boots in the ground traditional approach to a working landscape, they had the research. They often call the Harvard forest the wired woods or the weird woods. And then once you start walking around and looking, you'll see all this weird science out there. And I just found it fascinating, not even knowing what it did at first. But a subset of this material totally blew my mind. I didn't do that on purpose. I think we have a problem. Just go up one. Maybe close it and open again. That's 2 strikes on me. But a subset of this material set was what they call eco-debris or eco-trash. And this is all decommissioned experimental equipment that they'd put in resource piles around the Harvard forest. And you'd find these and you're like, why are there 32 giant fans sitting in the shrubs or whatever? Or why are there like 120 laundry baskets? And so this is where I kind of started my investigation. And the investigation was one part ideation, but also community building. And so I often joke with people that this is incredibly original work. I'm not saying it's original, it's use of color, its type, the forms. In fact, they're really rudimentary. I'd say they're original in that they originate in the people, the place, and the practice of the Harvard Forest Research community. So let's just unpack one. You might see this, and you might, that's a pretty funky lamp, and it's valid. But if you're a Harvard Forest researcher, you kind of look at it, and you could unpack all the material in the project. So the heat lamp is from a soil warming experiment. The ant nests are from a disturbance experiment. The wood is from a HWA simulation pull down. And so in many respects, the wood, the eco-debris embedded all the research, not just the folks that were working on the HWA stuff, but it was a way to kind of fold the entire community in. It was also kind of, they set the art direction for the project. In many respects, I just took from what was out there, and then again, working with them, we came up with a kind of art direction that they thought was going to be legible in the woods, but also engaging to multi-generational audience. We also pulled from, so we steal from design in terms of our practices. We also borrow from science communication. And so Neil deGrasse Tyson has this holy trinity of science communication, which I am a believer in. And so we layered that into the project as well. And so this is that at play. So this is a tick checkpoint. And so it's one part data collection point, one part public safety announcement, and one part, insect performance. Essentially, they would use this, the students who worked in the summertime, they would check themselves when they go by this thing, then they'd make a record of the ticks, but also then they'd use that information for the annual tick count. And so the work could have a functionality to it when it was done right. The community, they were telling the story. In many respects, I was just helping them through forms and color and graphics. The community they had expressions that they wanted to communicate. Again, they wanted to do a memorial to the tree. And so I was just using the language of the place in terms of the woodshed. The material itself was an expression of the cultural values. So we really tried to use recycled materials, and if we had to use something that was new, typically it was not heavy stains and paints. We used a lot of recycled materials found on site. And then we made some of the installations where they just promoted community interaction. And so the initial idea from one of the scientists was, let's take that dead tree on the right, that's a classic form for a dead and dying ecosystem in terms of hemlock, and let's tie notes on it. And I was like, well, man, that's like some Yoko Ono shit. They're done death, like 60s. Why don't we think about it? And also, it's going to look so ratty within 2 weeks. And so then I went back that weekend and made a little model. And so they often provided the kernel, and it was my job to kind of articulate it and make it work in the field. And then they're brilliant too. And they were like, okay, well, let's like tie forestry ribbon. And so people would write stuff on the forestry ribbon in response to the work. And I would have left it there, but you're working with nerds. And so they collect all the data, and they'd collect it quarterly just to see what people are responding to. And this is really one of the benefits of working with a research community, is they're going to push you to understand the work perhaps a little bit more than you're used to being. But the main thing is the community, the installations were like community program. And this kind of goes back to the idea of this diagram. It's IRL over URL. It's really more important to have deep, meaningful experiences with fewer people than kind of a broad, shallow broadcast of some of the information. Well, that was the logic behind this project. And it certainly has its critiques, but I'm a firm believer in this. The challenges. The first one was the site constraints. Active research forests, I'm not exaggerating. These are the site constraints. Everything you bring out there, you have to bring back. Fair enough. Everything you bring out there has to fit in the back of a Tacoma pickup truck. Okay, we can make modular. Everything, you can't dig in the ground. No guy wires, no foundations. You can't move a stick. And so you'll notice some of the pieces are actually built around logs and sticks. No lighting. It needs to come out at the end of a year. And I just thought that was wonderful, because it made it really clear like what we're doing and what we're not doing. And it actually provoked a lot of kind of creative solutions. One of the things I learned quickly, though, is that we do run into cultural perspectives in terms of professions. So sometimes we're looking at the exact same thing, and it felt like we were two Martians from different planets. But that actually prompted some interesting discussions about language, the use of jargon or buzzwords, professional language. And even just we would do these sort of exercises as kind of a meta exploration of the collaboration. But more importantly, through these conversations, I don't know why I didn't know this at the beginning, but like they're an evidence-based culture. They're like a show-me culture. So they really responded to the models, not so much the drawings, but the physical models. They were surprised that we needed outside fabricators. I blame all the artists for this. As designers, we help generate the idea, but often we're not the ones fabricating it. So they actually accused me, rightfully so, of starting an unsanctioned artist residency, because every couple of weeks I'd bring out people and pay them to help fabricate it. The resources, this is a question I get from a lot of young folks. How do you pay for it? There's so much more resources in the sciences than arts and culture sectors. It's just a fact, even now. And so this was paid for through a number of different grants. The Bullard Fellowship itself, if I could be so crass to talk about money, I think it was at $60,000 or $65,000 for the annual stipend. That's like a lifetime achievement award for many artists. And so for those folks who are interested in this space, there are opportunities there. But it was time intensive. This piece is a great example. That's what it looked like in the beginning. Was we were going to do a zigzag fence and put it around the black birch. We put it out there, it just got enveloped. And I walked by this thing for about 3 months, and it shamed me every time I walked by because it did not work. So then we went back to the model and reimagined the pieces with the same components. This idea of the kind of criteria for success is what derails or sinks a lot of collaborations. I think we were able to avoid that because from the very beginning, we said we're doing a science communication project. If it doesn't work as science communication, there's no need to argue it. And so that was kind of a really nice benchmark for us as we moved through the project. But more importantly, the big outcome was not the design or the art projects. The Harvard Forest does not fund open-ended creative expressions. what they are funding are opportunities in which the open-ended creative expressions create, meaning all the opportunities for engagement in PR. And these are just some of the categories in which we engage in the second half of the project. Ton of press, blah, blah, blah. The guided tours were definitely the backbone of it in terms of, I think, the impact. They had self-guided tours because everyone can't handle a guided tour. I think we did 24 lectures in that 1 year promoting the project. We pulled kind of models from other sectors, including the National Park Service, so the satellite model, where we did like little installations in urban areas to get people to go out to this remote site. So here are Risby and Urbano and Montserrat. Wonderfully enough, working with scientists, is they document the hell out of everything. And so all this work is available for anyone to use. I mean, provided you're not making t-shirts or whatever, but it's, common license, go for it. But the other thing is that they realize the power and the limitations of the temporary project. And so they brought in a crew to do a 20-minute film documentary, and this was kind of the capstone of the project. It actually gave the project a lot more reach. I mean, one of the limitations of site-based work is that it's site-based work. The big critique, there's always a big critique. You should welcome the big critique, because the big critique is just another opportunity. The big critique was you spent $200,000 or whatever for an awareness piece, like you didn't have a direct impact component to the work. And it was like, no, we didn't, but let's talk about that. And so we used the critique to build another project, and we just looked at different variables that we could change. So we brought it into a public setting. This is at the Science Plaza in Cambridge. We're not activists, but we worked with a host of activists and talked about how we can generate a piece that would actually give them some traction or some visibility for their work. And so it was essentially, I should mention this, the initial idea was a failed Matisse competition entry. So competitions are good if you use them for your own stuff, meaning this was enough to bring to the Harvard Forest folks and pitch it to them. They liked it, but they didn't get it. They didn't believe, they didn't study blue sticks. They didn't study Louis Barragan. They didn't know bounce light. And so then we made this model. We call it the $60,000 model. It costed about $300 in 2 days, but it allowed them to understand the optics of the work in terms of the moire pattern, the light, the shadows. And we went big. If you have the possibility, if it's possible, go big with your models, especially if they're dealing with optics. The wood, people are always asking, where do you get the material? Guess what? There was a glut of hemlock that had been preemptively salvaged from the insect. Where do you get the space? The Harvard Forest has giant buildings like this barn, which allowed, and you see my buddy Jack there up in the top. This work is not possible without having physical facilities. The work itself, this data viz or data visualization, which is most is a really uninspiring subset of graphic design. Like it's super clear, but super dry. And so we wanted to say, well, how can we layer in data, but also make it compelling? And so on one side of the piece, you have mean temperature increase from 1880 to current day, which was 2018. And on the other side, despite the oblique angle, you have 4 different scenarios. So one of the challenges of this type of work is how do you put people in the perspective of feeling empowered and not bummed out? And so we basically use scenario data. And so this was emissions data in which basically tracking consumption or projecting consumption. It actually asked the viewer where are they making a contribution or how are they contributing to each of these potential scenarios. And this is, again, another quib that we pull from journalism. It's like people always kind of stress the data. People aren't making decisions based on reproducible data sets. The data is important, but it really doesn't move body and mind, so to speak. And so our idea was have the data, but have this be an interactive piece. And what I mean by that is the reflection bench is made up of the components of the triangles. And so each year a new warning triangle is put on, and then is colored according to the new data set. And again, we had a couple little details to intimate that this was an ongoing piece. But moreover, it had to function as a piece of public art. And so it had to be, like the data wasn't enough. The data is never enough. And so again, depending on the angle in which you're looking at the piece and the sun, the idea is that you have this kind of personal experience with the work and the data. But more importantly, we partnered with a bunch of groups on and off campus who use the piece to celebrate their work and activism. And there's the kind of model broken down. And of course, the critique. What's the critique? How can you measure the impact? And this is one that haunts me to this day. If I used to look at the model this way, in terms of the practice model, it's more like this. It's much more messy. There's no hierarchy. But the big idea is you start with a shared mission or an agenda, you build off the science, and you modulate that with art and design. And then throughout the process, you're doing community engagement and outreach. And so it doesn't start with the Post-it note exercise or end with the photo op, the city council, but it's kind of integrated into the process and the output. It's been interesting to research this the last year and learning how other professions are looking at it. And so this is a typology set from Hannah Starr Rogers, who's looking at kind of 4 different typologies in terms of science communication. And so she's really looking at the cultural kind of impact, the context, and its function. So she has the conveyance model, which is the kind of one we always use. You're conveying information. The contributive, you're actually making a contribution to the science. Contextual, that's just about making it relevant and meaningful. And the critical, which is either criticizing science or more often than not, the poor use or misuse of science. And so I'm like, well, what if the context, the function, and the impact are all related to landscape itself? And so I'm proposing a 5th model, which I'm calling collaboratory, which is a term that is coined by Katrine Muff in 2014, but similar idea in that you're making a hybrid space between the scientists and the designers and artists. And again, it's site-based, but it's a co-design process. And some people always say to me, well, that's ridiculous. It's kind of like a unicorn project. Like, where are you going to find that? And these LTER networks are just that, as well as other research forests. Proud to say I'm starting 2 new ones, MacDunn Forest in Corvallis and the Tualatin Mountain Forest north of Portland. We're starting to explore these ideas with focus groups in a couple of studios. That said, I got 3 more slides. One of my colleagues at the LAF would love to say, don't be ridiculous. Landscapes are complex. There's lots of interlocking systems. You can't make every project like a science communication theme park. I'm not saying you need to do that. You can take any element from a science, from a site, such as the fence. So this was a 250-foot fence in which we basically told a story about DNA technologies using a grasshopper script, my only use of grasshopper ever, converting it to a CMYK colorway, or a tree guard. So these things can be humble, they can be aesthetic, and they can just be a layered part of the project. But as a final note, I would say is the future of landscape architecture, you have a special agency, you have a special power, you have access to these sites and the social capital to make this type of work. And again, you don't need to make it a giant theme park, but there's often many opportunities for embedding education into the work. These are the people that make my life lovely. These are my contacts. I'd be happy to talk about them offline or online right now. Thank you.